The American abandonment of Europe, how the EU is losing itself and the truth behind a century-defining geopolitical shift. The era of the United States quietly stepping away from Europe is not a spectacle of noise. There are no falling bombs, no armored convoys racing through the night, no declarations of war. The greatest geopolitical shift of this century arrives in silence. It appears when Washington turns its gaze toward the Pacific. It appears when German industrial giants begin dismantling their production lines. It appears when residents of Paris and Berlin stare helplessly at energy bills that have suddenly soared. And then, a question echoes across the entire continent. Are we still important to the United States? No one expected Europe to face such a moment. A Europe once confident it was the heart of the West. A Europe that believed decades of peace were a permanent foundation. A Europe that took pride in its welfare model, its multilateralism, its vast common market. They thought their model was the most complete version of human civilization. But the world does not ask Europe what it thinks. The world asks only whether Europe is strong enough to survive in an era defined by relentless competition. And today, the answer is no longer clear. As the U.S. pivots toward the Indo-Pacific, as Russia exerts security pressure on the continent, as China dominates global supply chains, an uncomfortable truth emerges. Europe has become the weakest link in the global power triangle. And worse still, many observers argue the EU is losing itself from within. This is no longer a military story. It is a story of economics, energy, technology, society, and the erosion of confidence in the future. It is no longer a question about NATO. It is a question about the survival of a model once celebrated as humanity's great experiment in unity. And when we confront this picture head-on, each layer fractures painfully. What happened to Europe? Why have Europeans lost trust in Brussels? Why do major powers no longer view the EU as a strategic center? And most importantly, will this era-defining shift end with Europe's rebirth or with the slow decay of an aging empire?
Welcome to the Cloud News, your destination for dynamic perspectives on economics, technology, and financial investment. From market fluctuations to intriguing social trends, we bring the world to you through in-depth analyses. It's not just news, but a lens to help you understand the world that is shaping today.
The United States pulls back from Europe, a quiet but ruthless strategic shift. When European diplomats read the latest U.S. national security strategy, what chilled them was not the text itself, but the silence between the lines. The silence where the word Europe once appeared prominently, repeatedly for 7 decades. For the first time in generations, the old continent is no longer positioned at the center of American foreign policy. And for NATO security experts, this is not merely a signal, it is a warning. Since the end of World War II, Europe has been Washington's primary strategic outpost. The U.S. did not defend Europe out of pure idealism. It defended Europe because its own survival as a global power depended on it. If the Soviet Union controlled Western Europe, the United States would be isolated. If communism overtook the continent, the global balance of power would collapse. And as part of that grand strategy, NATO was born, the Marshall Plan poured in capital, and America became the nuclear shield that covered the region. But the world has changed. Today, America's greatest strategic adversary is not Moscow. It is Beijing. No longer is global power defined by ideological confrontation. It is defined by competition in trade, technology, and military dominance. This forces Washington to shift its center of gravity toward the Pacific. And when a superpower pivots, the relative value of other regions inevitably changes. Western analysts emphasize that the U.S. is not abandoning Europe. It simply no longer sees Europe as indispensable. European security is no longer directly tied to America's strategic lifeline, and when a superpower stops seeing a region as vital, that region naturally loses priority in the distribution of resources. NATO is the first proof of this change. For decades, the U.S. covered nearly 70% of NATO's defense spending. European nations contributed far less while enjoying the safest environment in human history. Washington repeatedly urged Europe to increase defense budgets, but progress was painstakingly slow. Economic growth meant welfare took priority over tanks. An aging population meant elections mattered more than strategy. And decades of peace dulled any sense of urgency. But the war in Ukraine forced Europe to confront what the U.S. had warned about for 20 years. Europe is overly dependent. Dependent on Russian gas. Dependent on Chinese technology. Dependent on American security guarantees. And when all three pillars shake at once, the EU loses balance. Germany, Europe's economic engine, enters technical recession. France battles deep social unrest. Italy faces record national debt. The Netherlands witnesses the rise of EU skeptic parties. And in Brussels, discussions about the bloc's future grow increasingly tense. The height of Europe's empire, splendor, pride, and the shadow no one saw coming. There was a moment in modern history when Europe believed it had reached the peak of civilization. A moment when EU leaders walked out of summits with unshakable confidence. A moment when the euro emerged as the symbol of a shared future. A moment when the Schengen zone opened its skies, allowing a student from Portugal to fly to Austria with nothing more than an ID card. Europe believed it had created something the world would emulate, admire, and chase. The world called this Europe's golden era. But the irony of every peak is that the brighter the summit, the darker the shadow behind it. Every empire, at the moment of its greatest triumph, begins forming the cracks that will eventually undo it. Cracks so small at first that no one bothers to notice. But history always reveals the same rule. Empires rarely fall because of enemies, they fall because of internal contradictions concealed by pride. For 2 decades after the Cold War, Europe believed it no longer needed hard power to secure peace. It believed it did not need energy independence if Russia offered cheap gas. It believed it could outsource heavy industry to China without consequences. And above all, it believed something the U.S. saw clearly but never fully voiced. Europe believed it was entitled to American protection. If you examine EU speeches from 1995 to 2010, you will feel that confidence. Confidence so strong it bordered on illusion. Europe forgot that peace is not the natural state of the world, it is a conditional gift. And that gift is always paid for with strength. Why was the EU once so powerful? The reason is simple: expansion. From 12 original members, the EU grew to 27. Expansion meant territory. Expansion meant markets. Expansion meant political power. With over 500 million citizens, the EU became the world's largest unified market, bigger than the US. It became a global trade powerhouse. It built regulatory frameworks that shaped industries worldwide. When your market is that large, your rules become the world's rules. This was Europe's famed legal power. If a product wanted entry into Europe, it had to comply with European standards, from emissions to data privacy to food safety. Europe did not need weapons. It used its laws as instruments of influence, a peaceful empire of regulations, a model admired globally. But a painful truth lay beneath the admiration. Soft power only matters when supported by hard power. A beautiful building stands only if its steel frame is strong. The EU confused influence with strength, scale with capability, law with power. And when an empire misreads its own foundations, decline arrives silently. Europe's power rested on 3 pillars: economic strength, moral authority, the unity of the bloc. But its economy depended heavily on cheap Russian energy. Its moral authority depended on uninterrupted prosperity. Its unity depended on mutual trust that began to erode. Experts warned as early as 2005. The EU had become too large to manage efficiently, yet not strong enough to function as a true superpower. Internal contradictions multiplied. Wealthier nations resisted supporting poorer ones. Industrial nations clashed with agricultural ones. Eastern Europe wanted toughness toward Russia, while Western Europe wanted trade. The EU was one body forced to walk in many directions at once. Then came the cascade of global shocks. The 2008 financial crisis hitting Southern Europe. The 2015 migration crisis exposing demographic and cultural fractures. The 2020 pandemic exposing over-reliance on China. And the 2022 Ukraine war destroying the cheap energy model. The EU could not react fast enough. It was designed for consensus, not crisis. And the world had re-entered the most competitive era since World War II. Europe's weakness was no longer theoretical. It was practical, visible, measurable. Lacking weapons. Lacking energy independence. Lacking heavy industry. Lacking defensive capability. Lacking strategic unity, lacking a shared vision of the future. And as these weaknesses surfaced, the people noticed. Rising energy costs made them question policies once seen as enlightened. Industrial flight to the US made them question the green transition. Inflation made them question the competence of elites. War made them question whether Europe could protect itself without America. And that was the moment the European dream began to tremble. Not because of outside enemies, but because of internal limits long concealed. There are moments when history presses so heavily on a continent that every institution, every assumption, every familiar rhythm begins to strain under the weight. Europe now finds itself in precisely such a moment. Not because of a great war. Not because of a financial collapse. Not because of a natural disaster, but because the tectonic plates of global power are shifting, and Europe must confront a question it has avoided for over 70 years. Who are we when the United States is no longer standing behind us? This is not a question of tanks or treaties. It is a question of identity, of confidence, of purpose. A question about the entire model the EU has built since World War II, a model grounded in three core beliefs. Open markets generate prosperity. Union generates stability. America guarantees security. When all three pillars are challenged at the same time, a continent must reconsider everything it thought it knew about itself. In recent meetings, European leaders have begun invoking a term more frequently: strategic autonomy. It is not a new phrase, but it carries new urgency. Autonomy is no longer a luxury. It is becoming a necessity. Years of sequential crises, energy, migration, industry, war have forced Europe to confront a simple truth. A continent cannot outsource its future. Energy was Europe's first brutal lesson. When Russian gas stopped flowing, the industrial heart of Europe shuddered, not because Europe lacked technology, not because it lacked capital, but because it lacked a fallback. No major power can survive when its core industries depend on a single external provider. The lesson does not end with energy. It extends to supply chains, semiconductors, defense systems, and digital infrastructure. The second lesson is speed. This is an era defined by rapid decisions, rapid shifts, rapid escalation. But the EU's political architecture is built for meticulous deliberation, a virtue in peaceful decades, a handicap in turbulent ones. Speed is a new metric of power. And under that metric, Europe must transform or fall behind. The third lesson is unity. A union cannot endure if its members no longer believe in the same horizon, but every EU nation now faces radically different pressures. Germany fears industrial decline. France fears eroding leadership. Italy fears its mountain of debt. Poland fears its exposed borders. Hungary fears the loss of sovereignty. Northern Europe fears environmental backsliding. Each anxiety pulls the EU in a different direction. Without a common vision, Europe risks becoming a collection of countries connected by treaties rather than a true political community. Yet perhaps the most striking element of this moment is not the scale of the crisis, but the scale of the opportunity hidden within it. Crises have a way of stripping illusions and revealing potential. History shows that Europe repeatedly finds renewal at the edge of the abyss. This capacity is rooted in its culture, its science, its intellectual capital, and its long tradition of cooperation. Europe still possesses world-class universities, leading research institutions, a vast integrated market, a skilled workforce, and unparalleled regulatory influence. If the EU can redefine itself, it could emerge as the world's third major power center, not America's shadow, not China's counterweight, but an autonomous force with its own philosophy and priorities. A Europe that produces its own advanced weaponry. A Europe that generates its own energy through nuclear and pragmatic green technologies. A Europe that nurtures independent tech giants capable of competing globally. The question is not whether Europe can do this. The question is whether it will choose to. Transformation is not only policy, it is mindset. It requires admitting that what worked in the past may not work tomorrow. It requires stepping into uncertainty to design a new model. It requires acknowledging that prosperity cannot rely indefinitely on the protection or goodwill of another power. In the new global landscape, hard power is no longer optional. No strong defense, no lasting peace. No strong industry, no long-term prosperity. No strategic unity, no international role. This is a difficult truth for a continent shaped by the memory of war and the dream of peace. But the world today is not the world of the 1990s. This is not an age of effortless optimism. This is the age of competition. And that makes the story of the European Union not a story of decline, but a story of decision. Europe could drift into irrelevance. Europe could fracture into national camps. Europe could also reinvent itself as a sovereign geopolitical actor. Whether the continent fades or rises depends on the path its people choose, not Washington, not Beijing, not Moscow. Some scholars call this a reconstruction moment. Others call it an inflection point. But perhaps the most accurate description is this: a mirror moment. A moment when a union must look at its reflection, its strengths, its weaknesses, its illusions, its possibilities, and ask, who will we be for the rest of the century? Europe stands where three roads meet. The first road, remain dependent, accept a secondary role. The second, retreat into nationalism, risking fragmentation. The third, rebuild as an independent pole of global power, able to negotiate with the US, compete with China, and stabilize a turbulent world. Which road will prevail? History will decide, but the one certainty is this: Europe cannot return to the golden age of the past. That era is closed. Not as an ending, but as a reset. Because in every cycle of history, what we call the end is often just the beginning of something new. And the final question, the one Europe must answer and the world awaits, is this: can Europe rediscover itself, or will it become a melancholy chapter in the story of the 21st century? There are moments when history does not knock, it kicks the door open and forces an entire continent to confront itself. Europe is standing in the middle of such a moment not born of war, nor of financial collapse, nor of natural disaster, but of a global power realignment that exposes an unsettling truth. For the first time in more than 70 years, Europe must answer a question it has long avoided. Who are we when the United States is no longer behind us? This question is not merely about defense budgets or military alliances. It is deeper, about identity, confidence, and the future. It challenges the entire model the EU has relied upon since World War II, a model built on three foundational beliefs. Open markets bring prosperity. Integration brings stability. The United States guarantees security. When all three pillars are shaken simultaneously, a continent must rethink everything. In recent years, European leaders have spoken more frequently about strategic autonomy. It is not a new phrase, but today it carries different weight. Autonomy is no longer symbolic. It is becoming a condition of survival. Crisis after crisis in energy, migration, industry, geopolitics has forced Europe to acknowledge a simple truth. A continent cannot place its future in the hands of forces beyond its control. Consider energy. When Russian gas disappeared from Europe's pipelines, the continent's industrial core trembled. Not because Europe lacked expertise, not because it lacked resources, but because it lacked a viable alternative. A critical sector of the world's largest integrated economy had relied on a single external source. No major power can endure such fragility. Yet the lesson extends far beyond energy to critical minerals, manufacturing, supply chains, semiconductors, digital infrastructure, and defense capabilities. The second major lesson is speed. The world today does not move at the pace of lengthy summits and diplomatic negotiation cycles. It moves in real time, fast, disruptive, unforgiving. But the EU is structurally designed to be slow. In peaceful decades, this was a virtue, ensuring consensus and preventing rash escalation. In an era of global competition, however, slowness is a strategic liability. Speed has become a new measure of power. Europe must adapt to this metric or risk irrelevance. The third lesson is unity. No union can survive if its member states no longer believe they are walking toward the same destination. Yet every country in Europe today faces different pressures. Germany fears industrial decline. France fears diminished geopolitical influence. Italy fears its long-standing debt crisis. Poland fears the threat on its eastern border. Hungary fears losing political sovereignty. Northern Europe fears environmental regression. These divergent anxieties pull the EU in competing directions, complicating the search for a cohesive strategy. Without a shared vision, even the strongest institutions eventually weaken. Still, the deeper story of this moment lies not only in Europe's vulnerabilities, but in the opportunity embedded within them. For all its structural tensions, Europe retains immense potential for renewal. Throughout history, Europe has repeatedly rebuilt itself at the edge of catastrophe. This capacity comes from its intellectual capital, its scientific tradition, its cultural depth, and its long-established mechanisms of cooperation. Europe still possesses world-leading research institutions, a highly educated population, a sophisticated regulatory framework, a vast consumer market, strong democratic foundations, and enduring soft power. If the EU can redefine its strategic posture, it could emerge not as a subordinate actor or a passive ally, but as the third major pole in a multipolar world, distinct from the United States, independent of China, and resilient in an era of hard competition. Imagine a Europe capable of producing advanced weaponry rather than importing it. A Europe powered by balanced, realistic energy systems, nuclear paired with sustainable technologies. A Europe home to globally competitive technology giants instead of relying on foreign platforms. The question is not whether Europe can do this. The question is whether Europe will choose to do it. Transformation requires more than institutional reform. It requires a shift in mindset, a willingness to acknowledge that past success does not guarantee future security, a readiness to step into uncertainty and design new systems, and above all, the recognition that prosperity cannot rest indefinitely on another power's protective umbrella. In today's geopolitical environment, hard power is indispensable. Without military strength, there is no durable peace. Without industrial strength, there is no sustainable prosperity. Without strategic coherence, there is no international relevance. This reality is uncomfortable for a continent shaped by memories of war and decades of peace. But the world no longer resembles the optimism of the 1990s. This is not an age of easy certainty. It is an age of competition. That is why Europe's story is not fundamentally a narrative of decline. It is a narrative of decision. Europe now stands at a three-way crossroads. Path 1. Continue depending on external powers and accept a subordinate role in world affairs. Path 2. Retreat into nationalism, risking fragmentation and internal rivalry. Path 3. Rebuild as an autonomous geopolitical actor with its own coherent strategy. Which path will prevail? History will decide, but one truth is already clear. Europe cannot return to the golden age of the past. That era has ended. Not as a tragedy, but as a reset. Because every historical ending is also the start of something new. And so the final question, the one Europeans must now ask themselves, the one the world waits to hear, is this. Can Europe rediscover its identity, or will it become a melancholy chapter in the story of the 21st century?